All right, welcome in everyone. Kicking off another deep dive here. Today we're going to be looking at hypermedia learning environments. Like uh, clicking through all those interconnected web pages, those interactive e-learning modules, anything where you're kind of choosing your own adventure through information, not just following a straight line.
Yeah, exactly. And for this deep dive, you sent over a really comprehensive research article. It's like a really thorough look at both the potential, the exciting stuff, and then the real world challenges of actually using these hypermedia systems to learn. It brings in a whole bunch of different studies, too.
Yeah, and the big question we're going to wrestle with today is this. Does giving learners all this control, does it actually help them learn better? Like really understand things and remember more? On the surface, it seems like it should, right? You're the one calling the shots, choosing your path. But when you look at the research, it's way more complicated than that.
Mm.
So that's what we're going to unpack today. Why is that?
Okay, so to start, like when hypermedia first came on the scene, there was a lot of optimism, a lot of excitement about what it could do for learning. What were some of those big reasons for that initial enthusiasm?
Well, one of the early ideas was that the way hypermedia is all linked together, it kind of mirrored how our brains work, with all those connections and associations we're always making.
Yeah.
But the research points out that this initial assumption, well, it didn't really hold up. Our brains are way more intricate than just clicking links.
Yeah, that's interesting though, right? Because even though that specific idea about mimicking the brain didn't pan out, there were still other really compelling reasons why people were excited about hypermedia. Like one big one was the idea that giving learners more control could really boost their interest and motivation. That feeling of like, hey, I'm in charge here, I get to choose, was seen as a huge plus.
Definitely.
Mm.
The thinking was that if you're the one driving your learning journey, you're naturally going to be more invested, more engaged in the process.
That makes sense.
That's right. And then there's also the idea that you could tailor the whole learning experience to your own needs, like what you already know.
And if you think about it in the bigger picture, you can see why it was so appealing. It promised this much more personalized way to learn, right? And it wasn't just about keeping people interested. There was also this belief that actively navigating, making decisions about what to explore, all that would actually lead to people processing the information more deeply. Like, it would be a more active way of connecting ideas than just, say, passively reading a textbook.
Right. You're not just sitting there absorbing, you're actively figuring things out, deciding what's important, where to go next. And that active engagement, that was seen as a way to help you develop those self-regulation skills, like how well you can manage your own learning.
So we've got all these potential benefits of giving learners control in hypermedia. It seemed like a really big deal. But you mentioned earlier that the research, well, it hasn't always shown that this control actually translates to better learning, especially when you compare it to those more structured environments where, the system kind of guides you more. So why do you think there's this disconnect between the initial excitement and what the research is actually finding?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. It turns out that the very thing that makes hypermedia so attractive, that freedom to explore, well, it can also create some big roadblocks for learners. And the research points to a few key usability problems that can actually get in the way of learning.
Okay, so let's dig into those. The first one, and I bet a lot of people listening have experienced this, is disorientation, that feeling of getting lost in hyperspace. What does the research tell us about this? And are there different ways this feeling of being lost can show up?
Oh, yeah, totally. That feeling of being completely lost in the information, not knowing where you are, what to look at next, how to even get back to something you saw earlier, it can be super frustrating. And the research actually breaks down this disorientation into a few types. So first, there's navigational disorientation. Basically, you don't understand the structure of the system, how it's organized, so you end up going in circles, doing a bunch of inefficient searching.
Right, right. And then there's what they call the embedded digression problem. This is when you've got a million windows open, you're constantly jumping back and forth between different things, which probably means your brain is having a hard time keeping track of all those tangents.
Yeah, and then the third type, it's actually got a pretty vivid name. It's called the art museum problem.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really good analogy. It's like when you're clicking through links so fast, just skimming stuff, kind of like rushing through an art museum without really stopping to appreciate anything.
Hmm.
And of course, that leads to, not really understanding or remembering much. And there was this one interesting perspective in the research that suggested maybe a tiny bit of disorientation, like a little confusion, could actually be good because it sparks curiosity. But overall, most of the research shows that the more lost people felt, the less they learned. It's like all that mental energy spent trying to just navigate the information, it takes away from actually learning the content itself.
Absolutely. And it seems like just having a ton of choices, like all those links in a hypermedia environment, that can actually contribute to this feeling of being overwhelmed and lost. So it's not just a case of more options, better learning.
No, not at all. And then, kind of related to that whole disorientation thing, there's the issue of distraction. In these hypermedia environments where you can go anywhere, it's so easy to get sidetracked, click on something that seems interesting, but it's not really connected to what you're supposed to be learning.
Oh, tell me about it. You could be trying to, like, I don't know, understand the causes of World War I, and next thing you know, you're 3 clicks deep into the history of, like, military uniforms or
Mhm.
something. And the research actually shows that even if you're not deliberately trying to go off topic, these competing points of interest, they can mess with your learning. It's probably because your brain has to work harder to stay focused on that main goal.
That makes sense. So it's like, is
Yeah.
all distraction bad? The research mentions this idea of serendipity,
Hmm.
that you might stumble across some useful information by accident while you're exploring. But I think the overall message is that if you've got specific learning goals, that downside of getting distracted, it usually outweighs those happy little accidents.
For sure. And then we've got the third major usability challenge, which is cognitive overload. All that freedom to navigate, to decide what to click and explore, it takes mental effort.
Mm.
And the worry is that if you're spending too much brain power figuring out how to learn in the system, you'll have less left over for actually understanding and remembering the information itself.
Right, like your brain can only handle so much at once. If it's working overtime on navigation, there's less processing power available for learning the content.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that some research suggests that hypermedia itself doesn't necessarily overload your working memory more than, say, reading a traditional text. But it might require you to use your brain differently, tap into different mental skills, especially things like spatial processing, like understanding the layout of the information, how it all connects, which might be why people who are good at spatial reasoning, they sometimes do better in hypermedia
It's
environments.
not just about the amount of information, but the
Mhm.
way your brain has to process it in hypermedia.
Right. And these three usability problems, that disorientation, the distraction, the cognitive overload, they're all kind of intertwined. They can all work against each other and really undermine the potential benefits of giving learners all that control. It's like that freedom comes with these hidden costs that can actually affect how well you learn.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just give people control and they'll learn better. There's more to it.
Exactly. And the research makes another really important point here. Not all learners are equally equipped to deal with this much freedom. It turns out that your own individual characteristics, like who you are as a learner, those play a huge role in how successful you'll be in hypermedia environments.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What are some of the key individual differences that the research highlights as being especially important?
Well, one of the biggest ones is your prior knowledge, how much you already know about the subject. The research consistently shows that learners who are starting with less prior knowledge, they tend to have a harder time in hypermedia environments. They get lost more easily, they don't process the information as deeply, and ultimately they don't learn as much. It's like if you don't have that basic foundation to build on, it's harder to know what's important, how things connect.
That makes perfect sense. You need that context. And the research even talks about something called the Matthew effect in this context, right?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating point. It basically means that hypermedia can sometimes widen the gap between stronger and weaker students. So those who already know a lot, they can use that freedom to explore and construct their own understanding. They might even benefit from presentations that are less structured, that encourage them to think more deeply. But beginners, they often need more guidance, more structure to help them build that initial understanding.
So it's almost like hypermedia can make the strong learners even stronger.
Right.
But if you're not careful, it could leave those who are struggling even further behind.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it's so important for hypermedia designers to think about how to support those learners who are coming in with less prior knowledge. Maybe offer more scaffolding, more structure, so they don't get lost and overwhelmed.
This is definitely not one size fits all.
Okay.
Okay, so prior knowledge is huge. What other learner characteristics are really important?
Another big one is self-regulatory skills. Hypermedia requires a lot of self-regulation. You need to be able to monitor your own understanding. Are you getting it? Do you need to go back? You have to be able to pick good learning strategies. And of course, you got to stay motivated throughout the whole process. And the learners who have those strong self-regulatory skills, they tend to do really well in hypermedia.
So it's like if you're good at figuring out what you need to learn and how to learn it effectively, you're going to be in a much better position to take advantage of all that freedom hypermedia gives you.
Exactly. Some research even shows that your metacognitive awareness, that's like your awareness of your own thinking process, that can predict how well you'll learn, especially in those hypermedia structures that really force you to make sense of the connections yourself. And then, of course, there's motivation and interest. Those are always key, no matter what kind of learning environment you're in.
It seems like your attitude towards learning matters too, right? Like what you believe about knowledge and how learning works.
Yeah, that's a good point. While the research on general cognitive styles is still kind of fuzzy, it does seem like your epistemological beliefs, your beliefs about the nature of knowledge, those matter. So learners who believe that knowledge is complex, that learning takes effort, those learners tend to perform better in those flexible hypermedia environments that present multiple perspectives. But if you have a more simplistic view, like if you think knowledge is just a bunch of facts to memorize, you might struggle in those more open environments.
So your mindset about learning plays a role too.
Absolutely. And all of this kind of underlines what the research calls the learner control principle, which basically says that giving learners lots of control is generally better for those who already have a solid base of knowledge and those who are good at learning on their own.
So it's not a bad thing to give control, but you got to be mindful of who you're giving it to and how they're going to handle it.
Exactly. And then the research also points to another big challenge in this whole field. We need better theoretical frameworks to guide how we design and study hypermedia learning environments.
Okay, so when you say theoretical frameworks, what do you mean exactly?
Well, when you're designing hypermedia, there are two main things to consider. First, there's the design of each individual component, like the text, the images, the videos, all that stuff. And there are theories of multimedia learning that can help with that. But the second thing, and this is really specific to hypermedia, is deciding how and why you're going to offer certain learner control options. Like, should you let learners choose the order of information? Should they be able to select specific content or change how it's presented? And why are you making those choices as a designer?
So it's not just about throwing in a bunch of control features randomly. There needs to be some thought behind it.
Right. And the research suggests that a lot of studies haven't really explained the reasoning behind those learner control design choices. They haven't clearly laid out the instructional approach they're using or the specific cognitive processes they expect to happen when learners use their hypermedia system. And without that theoretical foundation, it's hard to know why some systems work better than others or how to apply those findings to different learning situations.
So it's like you need a good theory to back up your design choices.
Exactly. But the good news is the article does highlight some theoretical frameworks that show promise for future research and design. Like there's augmented cognitive load theory, which basically reminds us that while giving learners control might seem helpful, it also adds to their mental workload. They have to make more decisions, and we need to make sure that extra mental effort doesn't take away from their actual learning.
So it's about finding that balance.
Right. Then there's cognitive flexibility theory, which suggests that hypermedia might be especially good for advanced learning, when you're dealing with complex, messy topics, because it allows learners to see things from different angles, to compare and contrast.
And what about elaboration theory? How does that apply to hypermedia?
Well, that one proposes using hypermedia in a top-down way. You start with a broad overview of the main concepts, and then learners can dive deeper into specific details through links. The idea is that having that initial big picture understanding helps learners make better choices about what to explore.
Okay, so you give them a map before you let them loose.
Exactly. And then there's Kinch's construction integration model, which is pretty interesting. It suggests that for learners who already know a lot, those less structured hypermedia presentations might actually be better because they force the learner to make more connections themselves, to really build their understanding actively.
So sometimes a little less structure can be a good thing.
Yeah, it depends on the learner. And the point is, having a solid theoretical foundation is super important. It's not just some abstract academic thing. It's crucial for designing hypermedia that actually helps people learn effectively.
So we need good theory and good design to make this work.
Exactly. And the last piece of the puzzle that the research brings up is that a lot of the studies that have looked at hypermedia learning, Well, they've had some methodological flaws.
Okay, when you say methodological flaws, what do you mean?
Well, some studies have had really small sample sizes, which means you can't really generalize the findings to a wider population. Others have had experimental designs where it's hard to tell what's really causing the learning outcomes they observed. And sometimes the way they measured learning might not have captured the unique benefits that hypermedia could potentially offer. Like if one of the big advantages of hypermedia is that it connects information in a cool way, then your assessment should really test whether learners can make those connections.
Right, you should measure what matters.
Exactly. But maybe the biggest methodological challenge comes from the fact that when you give learners control over their learning, you're going to get a lot of variation in how they actually use the system. Some people might click every single link, while others might follow a very narrow path. And a lot of studies haven't really taken those different usage patterns into account.
So you could have two people using the exact same hypermedia system, but having totally different learning experiences.
Absolutely. And that's why the research emphasizes how important it is to analyze log files. Those detailed records of where learners click, how long they spend on each page, the order in which they go through things. That data can give you amazing insights into their learning strategies, like how are they sequencing the content? What are they choosing to explore? Are they really digging deep or just skimming?
So it's like being able to see inside their learning process.
Exactly. And studies that have looked at those navigation patterns, they've often found that learners who take a more active and thorough approach, they explore lots of links, they engage deeply with the content, those learners tend to learn more. But the ones who are more passive, who just skim the surface, they don't do as well. And not surprisingly, the way learners navigate is often related to those individual characteristics we talked about earlier, like their prior knowledge and their interest in the topic, although those relationships can be pretty complex.
So it's not just about whether learners have control, it's about how they use that control.
Exactly. And to really understand what's going on, we need to connect that log file data to the specific instructional approach that's being used. Are learners actually using the hypermedia in a way that's aligned with the learning goals the designers had in mind? That's the key question.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. As we wrap up, what are the big takeaways for our listeners, the people who are out there using hypermedia to learn every day?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that just because you're giving control over your learning, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to learn better. The way the hypermedia environment is designed, and even more importantly, your own skills as a learner and how you approach navigating that environment, those are the things that really matter.
So if you're trying to learn something new, something complex, and you're using hypermedia, be aware that you might get lost or distracted. Try to build a mental map of how the information is structured and keep those learning goals in mind as you go.
Definitely. And don't forget about your prior knowledge. If you're a beginner, you might need more structure, more guidance, especially at the beginning.
And pay attention to how you're interacting with the material. Are you just clicking through links, or are you really trying to make connections, understand the relationships between different ideas?
Be active, be strategic.
So this deep dive really shows us that hypermedia has a lot of potential, but it's not some magic solution. It takes good design, design that minimizes those usability problems and supports different types of learners. And it also takes you, the learner, being actively involved, being strategic, and focusing on those learning goals.
It makes you wonder, as these learning technologies keep developing, how can we design environments that really empower learners without overwhelming them? Environments that help them build real deep understanding, not just give them the illusion of control.
That's a great question to think about. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.